Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to very quickly hand over, so that we don't waste any more time, I'm going to very quickly hand over to Umakanth to do his presentation on flipping companies across borders, an Asian perspective.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back again to this second session. Happy to be here, as Dan said, to be interacting with a lot of friends. So this paper is something that I kind of started working on a couple of months ago, so it's fairly new. So the reason for this paper is because over the last couple of years, there was a phenomenon where we started seeing companies which had earlier moved from India to Singapore, moving back from Singapore to India. And so that there was a lot of discussion among practitioners. There were a lot of law firm memos about this. But then I was quite curious to see how this pans out from an academic perspective. So I thought I'll embark on this from a scholarly angle and to see what the issues are. So what is the literature on the topic? There's a fair amount of literature on this, and some of it is fairly controversial and very well known in legal academia. The first is the US state charter competition, which is familiar to all of us, where we've been talking about the dominance of Delaware and now the threat to Delaware with Dexit. So the Delaware dominance or the decline of Delaware has come back into the literature quite a bit. And there's also a European discussion on reincorporations, where there's a lot of discussion since the Centros case at the turn of the century, and the concept of reincorporations within European context. And there have been other discussions of reincorporations and corporate mobility as well. And I'd like to acknowledge Jennifer's paper in the Vanderbilt Law Review on the move of News Corp from Australia to Delaware. Was it about like 15, 20 years ago, I think it was, Jennifer?
I think it was about 2010.
10, yeah. So that was also something that Jennifer did as a case study in that context. Another thing which I found very interesting is the whole concept of cross-listing, which is slightly different from reincorporations. But there's a lot of literature coming out from the US, especially from Jack Coffey and others, who talk about the bonding hypothesis, where companies cross-list in other jurisdictions just to demonstrate their ability or the willingness to adhere to higher level norms than in their home jurisdictions. So what is the common thread in the existing literature? The common thread is one of the reasons for corporate mobility is the quality of the legal system in the home jurisdiction and the host jurisdiction. And there are a lot of theories which I'll come to. One theory which is very well known in the US context is the state competition theory, the race to the bottom, race to the top. And the most cynical view is one of regulatory arbitrage, which is companies will always move to a jurisdiction which is more friendly and more lenient than the jurisdiction where they are in. So this set me thinking from a Asian angle, looking at Singapore and India. And my argument, which I will be very keen for some of you to respond both positively and negatively, is as follows. So for reasons I will explain, there are three arguments in this paper. The first argument is in the Singapore-India story, there is no evidence of state competition. So it's not like Singapore and India competing with each other, unlike the US states, to keep these companies within their jurisdictions. And the second thing is there's no evidence of regulatory arbitrage either. It's not that these companies are moving from Singapore to India because India has a more lenient legal system. There are other reasons for doing so. And the third thing this paper finds is there is no evidence of the bonding hypothesis. It's not like these companies are moving back to bond themselves to a higher level law or not. So what is the finding here? The finding here is different from the conventional wisdom, which is companies are moving from one country to another, not so much for the quality of the legal system, but for the ability to fundraise. So whichever is the place where it's easier to raise funds, possibly some of which could include the reason that the law is better, that's the main reason for why companies are moving. And the second thesis of this paper is if there's no regulatory competition, if there's no regulatory arbitrage, what we find is what I would think of as cross-regulatory facilitation. And this is something that I'll come to in a second. So this, in a nutshell, is what the paper is kind of about, which is to challenge some of the conventional understanding of corporate mobility, which operates in a different way in the Indian context. And this goes back to the points that Dan has made in his preliminary remarks yesterday, which is we need to think about Asia from a different lens. Not that we are doing it like deliberately here, but it seems like the conventional Anglo-American understanding of corporate law doesn't seem to work in the corporate mobility story here as well. So what do we find in terms of the trends? We find two trends here, and I call them wave 1 and wave 2. Wave 1 is the move from India to Singapore. So at the turn, for the last 25 years, in the early 2000s, there was a trend where a lot of Indian startups were actually incorporating a holding company in Singapore. And the operating company will be a 100% subsidiary in India. The owners of the companies are in India, the founders are in India, all the businesses are also in India. So these are the typical tech startups. I don't know how many of you, so the Arja and Akshaya will be very familiar with this, but for those of you who have been to India more recently, I think pretty much like China, there is an app for everything. If you've forgotten something here, you can order, like if I've forgotten the clicker, I could have reached here 15 minutes ago, and before my presentation starts, the clicker would be in my hand, right? So these are the kind of startups that are operating in the Indian context. And a lot of them established their holding companies in Singapore in the first wave. And why did they do that? Because these were early stage companies. They needed a lot of funding, and they needed angel investment, PE investment, and VC investment from so-called global investors, mostly in the US. And so at that stage, these US investors were unwilling to invest directly into an Indian company because they were uncertain about many things, including the ability to enforce shareholder rights and basically problems with contractual enforcement and governance more generally. So they incorporated they would rather invest in a Singapore company and deal with all the shareholder disputes at the Singapore level, and be subject to the corporate law in Singapore, whereas all the operations are going to be in the Indian context, in the Indian wholly owned subsidiary. So a lot of these structures were like this. I'm using India and Singapore as the example, but the Singapore company could even have been a Delaware company. So a lot of Indian companies also incorporated holding companies in Delaware. So I'm using Singapore as the example, but it's not the only route that was there. There was Delaware as well, predominantly, because some of the examples I discuss in the paper include Delaware companies. So what happened in the last 3-4 years is the opposite. These companies which were incorporated in Singapore as holding companies suddenly started going back to India. And this is what is called as the reverse flip structure, or the reverse migration structure, where these holding companies effectively merged into their subsidiaries in India, and the whole holding company in India, holding company in Singapore, subsidiary in India structure got collapsed into a sole structure in India only, and these investors became investors of so the founders and the PE VC investors became investors in the Indian company. So this is what is called as a reverse flip structure, or there's a term in India. I won't use the Hindi term for it, but it's called homecoming, right? So a lot of the Indian so-called Delaware incorporated and Singapore incorporated companies went back to India. So this was a phenomenon that I kind of look at in this paper, and I come up with kind of 3 thesis statements as to why this is happening, and I'll get into a little bit of detail in the remaining time that I have. The first thesis is, thanks, Vivian. Sorry, Michelle. Yeah.
You don't have your glasses on.
Yeah. So, materially, I saw the number on it. Yeah. So I make 3 kind of statements. So unlike typical corporate migrations, which are usually one way, I call this the life cycle determined bidirectional mobility. So migration need not be one way. It can be in one direction at a certain life cycle stage of a company, and then the company may have to come back to its own home jurisdiction at the second stage for reasons that we will discuss in a short while. So this depending on the life cycle of the company, it will determine what the stage for the corporate movement is. And this is not unusual. This is so for example, a lot of companies incorporated in California and other parts of the US, they migrate to Delaware at the time that they have to list. But here it's the opposite. They migrated out of India at the time that they wanted to raise private capital, but they are coming back to India to list. So it's kind of slightly different from the typical understanding of corporate migration, which is what is a bidirectional kind of method, which is fairly new in the Indian context. So the second thesis, as I've already suggested, is the reason why it seems these companies are migrating is mainly for fundraising, which has limited emphasis on the quality of the legal system. So what happens at the stage that Indian companies move to Singapore? It was basically on what is there on the forward, what I call the forward flip, which is basically to raise money from private capital owners, and such as angels, VCs, and PEs. And here the bonding thesis is quite important because the investors were willing to invest only in a Singapore company or a Delaware company because they were familiar with the context. They were more confident of enforcing their rights in that kind of a context as opposed to investing directly in the Indian company. But when it comes to reverse flip, there is still a fundraising angle, but the fundraising angle is based on the companies going for an IPO. And this is a very important aspect that I haven't mentioned till now. Why are these companies moving back to India? Because in 2025, India was one of the markets which witnessed the highest number of IPOs anywhere in the world. So the market is very liquid. It's quite dominant in terms of the IPOs. Not in terms of values, in terms of volume, it is quite high. So I think there was something like 350 IPOs last year alone. So which is why these companies want to cash in on that boom, and that's why they are moving back to India, and they don't care so much about the quality of the legal system and so on. I'm not suggesting that the quality of the legal system doesn't matter, because India has also made a lot of reforms in the last few years on governance, which has made it quite comfortable for companies to go back to the Indian context. But the fundraising angle is kind of fairly significant in that sense. And the third question is there regulatory competition or regulatory arbitrage? There doesn't seem to be evidence of either in a large sense. And this is where what I would call as cross-regulatory facilitation. And two trends are evident. There's a lot of detail in the paper about transaction structures and so on. They use cross-border mergers, reverse flips. I don't have the time to get into it. But what is the key focus here? The focus here is India is making an active effort to bring these companies back. So they are easing the cross-border merger rules. They're making it easy for these companies to come back. What is Singapore doing? Singapore is not doing anything, because it is still possible to migrate a Singapore company into India using a scheme of arrangement method, which Singapore courts are ready to approve so long as the formalities are completed. So one question that arises in terms of competition versus arbitrage is, what is Singapore's continuing role? Why is Singapore not concerned about this migration of Indian companies? I think one argument is these are only a handful of companies. These are not like a whole ton of companies. There is certainly a loss of revenue and fees and things like that for Singapore, but it's not like a huge loss. But at the same time, one hypothesis, and this goes back to some of the papers that came up yesterday, including Dan, Wei, and Chun, right? So why is Singapore not concerned? Because there are other companies which are which are migrating to Singapore and incorporating in Singapore, including a lot of the Chinese companies. Shein has been talked about a lot yesterday. And I know Dan and others didn't mention it, but I've been reading a lot about the concept of Singapore washing, right? So there's evidence of Singapore washing in this, because this move, unlike the Indian move, the move of Chinese companies has to do with geopolitics as opposed to fundraising and others. So what is the implication for theory here? I'll just take 30 seconds, Michelle. So Singapore's approach here in terms of a theoretical perspective, it's not driven by regulatory competition or regulatory arbitrage. It's more about, there's a sense of agnosticism towards this approach, because if one set of companies are going out, another set of companies is coming in. So there's no threat really for Singapore's position, unlike, for example, like Delaware, for instance. So that's kind of one example. So just to kind of conclude, the preliminary conclusions so far are, I think the key things, areas where this episode is different from the typical understanding of corporate migration. I think one is this is moving in two directions based on life cycle of companies. Fundraising seems to be more important driver than regulatory arbitrage or regulatory competition. The bonding hypothesis worked in the initial stage when companies needed to move to Singapore, but when they're coming back to India, the quality of the legal system doesn't seem to matter. And the last is there's no regulatory competition or arbitrage. It's mostly a case of cross-regulatory facilitation. So these are some thoughts to begin with, and I would look forward to Akshaya's comments and the rest of you as well as I develop this further.
Thanks for the opportunity to continue to be part of this conference and community, and thanks for the opportunity to read such a good paper and comment on it. I'll offer, most of my comments are on the framing, I think. So maybe if I can take a step back from the legal framing, in different disciplines, there's this different disciplines, including economics, and I'll talk about, I like Brian Kaplan's work on immigration, and he likes open borders. So if you're thinking of human capital, he says that if you have open borders, then human capital will move to the places that are most conducive to them, and the GDP of the world will double. And you should actually apply the same lens to companies, and in an ideal world, there'll be no rules actually pushing companies to go in one way or the other, but we don't live in an ideal world. So in each jurisdiction, there's different priorities and policy choices, and I think Umakanth's framing was that law probably doesn't matter so much, finance matters more, and I wanted to go back to the Laporta and co-authors, the debate that created. Law matters, institutions matter. I think Umakanth's work brought out the role of institutions in the cross-facilitation between Singapore and India, how the courts are allowing it across the two countries. But the third thing is also politics matters. While there's no geopolitics here, I think it's still India recognizing that this is happening, this dynamic is happening, and the government coming in and trying to facilitate more, because there is an interest in bringing these tech companies back into India, and the same interest has been articulated by the government to bring back human capital into India. We know the CEOs around the world for tech companies are Indian CEOs. So far, the government used to boast about this, but now there is this understanding that that's not something, that's not the end of the world. We need to have homegrown talent. And so I see your paper as part of that conversation, and maybe the next extension or what you might add to this paper could also be as a guidance to the government in terms of what they can continue to do to facilitate this. A lot of Asian countries, like I think Indonesia, some other, at least Indonesia recently introduced dual class shares. I know it's the same sort of concept. They want the tech companies to either remain there or to attract them back. China has like carrot and stick approach. I would like India to just do carrots approach. But to go to the more on the cross facilitation, right? To now link this back to the regulatory race to the bottom, race to the top arguments. It's good to see these two countries as Singapore as a financial hub. It would be very not in its favor to adopt protectionist strategies and create disincentives for companies to move back, because that would disincentivize future Indian founders from going to Singapore. So I think this is in line with the whole literature, including Aurelio's work on Singapore being a financial hub. And working in tandem. So we see that India has, if you can be, if you're able to attract companies in a certain life cycle, the life cycle approach that Umakanth mentioned, if you can lean into attracting companies at a certain stage in their life cycle, then that's good. Here, I think part of the finance dynamic you've outlined is that driven, my intuition is that it's driven by a lot more retail investors, including through mutual funds. And this rush, I think 2 years ago I was working on retail investors in Korea and India and how influencers drove some of that. So in the India story there was about how Indian retail investors are just getting acquainted with how to invest, and so now they're driven from investing in real estate and gold into actually investing into capital markets. So the Korean, thank you, the Korean reforms around, because there's more retail shareholding in Korea, the government has responded to that in certain ways. Maybe there's good and bad lessons to take from that. So maybe if you can also say how down the line it's good to have this for retail investors protections, or maybe to avoid the trap of making laws due to populist pressures, that would be nice. So that was that side of it. And I also thought when you mentioned all the literature around where companies moving to Delaware, the local US literature around moving out of Delaware to Nevada and Texas. There's also, I think I told Wei yesterday about Will Moon has written a few papers on Chinese companies going to offshore jurisdictions, and he frames it as offshore jurisdictions being Delaware's competition. And I think it could just be part of the story around regulatory competition, I guess. But speaking of Asia, I think it's interesting because companies from China are choosing certain things when they go to these other jurisdictions. And in terms of significance of this work beyond India, a little bit to Singapore, like I said, in furthering its status as a financial hub, but also to other jurisdictions that might be wanting to attract back their unicorns and tech companies. I know in Australia there's a lot of angst around why we can't hold on to the tech startups in Australia, so it could be relevant beyond as well. I think I'll stop there.